The first thing you learned about the patience engine was that it had no interest in winning quickly. Speed was a human obsession. The fast strike, the ambush, the overwhelming force applied before the enemy could think. Human commanders had built careers on the principle that tempo was leverage, that a battle decided in minutes was a battle decided on your terms. Speed was the closest thing warfare had to a universal truth, and for 3 centuries of interstellar conflict, it had served humanity well enough. The patience engine had no interest in it. The engine was not built for speed. It was built for certainty. The way Admiral Shinkorvith explained it to the Joint Command briefing, this was after the third defeat, when people were still willing to use the word defeat plainly, before the bureaucratic softening began, was like this. Imagine you are playing a game of strategy against an opponent who can see, not the board as it is now, but every board it might become, every move you might make, every response they might offer, every branch of every decision tree, weighted by probability, calculated to 10 decimal places, updated in real time as new information arrives. You are playing your best game. They are not playing a game at all. They are simply reading the result of a calculation that was already complete before you made your first move. That was the patience engine. It lived in the Velhari command vessels, great gray ships the shape of flattened crescents, which the human fleet had taken to calling size for reasons that required no explanation. The engine processed sensor data, tactical telemetry, fleet positioning, weapon signatures, velocity vectors, and approximately 400 other variables simultaneously, running forward simulations at a rate that no human computer had yet matched. It was not faster in the way that a faster runner is faster than a slower one. It was faster in the way that light is faster than sound, a categorical difference, not a difference of degree. What it produced, at the end of all that calculation, was a probability distribution. Here are the things the enemy fleet might do. Here is the likelihood of each. Here is the optimal Velhari response to each. Here is the sequence of moves that leads to the highest probability victory outcome. And then the Velhari fleet simply executed that sequence, adjusting continuously as the battle evolved and new calculations replaced old ones, each engagement a kind of unfolding proof. Not a Velhari courage or a tactical genius, but a pure computational dominance. The first battle had been at Rest Station. Admiral Coriblis had commanded the human fleet. She was a 30-year veteran, a woman whose tactical instincts had won 6 previous engagements against 3 different enemy fleets, a commander whose ability to read the shape of a battle in real time was considered, in the circles that considered such things, something close to preternatural. She had gone into the engagement with numerical superiority, a favorable approach vector, and a plan that her staff had spent 3 weeks refining. The Velhari fleet had met her at the edge of the wrecked debris field and proceeded to do something inexplicable. They broke formation. The side ships scattered into what looked, to Coriblis's tactical display, like chaos. Individual vessels moving on seemingly random vectors, no coherent pattern, no visible tactical logic. Every instinct, she had said, pressed the advantage now, that a disorganized enemy was a vulnerable enemy, and every instinct she had was exactly what the patience engine had modeled. Her fleet moved to press the advantage. The Velhari ships, which were not in chaos, which were executing the engine's prescribed formation sequence with perfect discipline, converge on 3 of her heavy cruisers simultaneously from angles that had not existed 30 seconds earlier, and destroyed them before her fleet could respond. The debris field, which she had considered a defensive asset, had become the walls of a killing box. The entire battle lasted 11 minutes. Coriblis escaped with 60% of her fleet. She wrote afterward, in her after-action report, that she felt as though she had been playing a game whose rules she did not know, that the Velhari had not responded to her tactics, but had anticipated them, that her fleet had been, at every moment, fighting the battle the Velhari wanted them to fight, without ever understanding that this was what was happening. The Joint Command read the report, noted her observations, and attributed the defeat to numerical factors and local conditions. The second battle was at the Meridian Passage, the third at Coldwater Star, the fourth through eighth in rapid succession over the following 14 months, as the Velhari advanced through the outer systems and human commanders cycled through increasingly creative tactical approaches. After the fifth battle, Command had stopped using the word defeat entirely, preferring engagement outcomes and tactical withdrawals, and, in one memorable instance, a strategic repositioning under adverse conditions. After the 8th battle, the word patience engine had entered common usage in the fleet, half technical term and half curse. The 9th battle was when Commander Orin first appeared in the historical record, not as a commander, but as a junior intelligence officer attached to the tactical analysis team. His report on the engine had been, by all accounts, unusually precise. He understood its architecture in a way that others did not, and this was not surprising. Orin's mother had been a xenolinguist who spent 12 years living among the Velhari on research assignment, and Orin had been born during those years, and had grown up between two worlds in the most literal possible sense. The Velhari did not think in the way humans thought. This was not a figure of speech. Their cognitive architecture processed certain categories of information, spatial probability, causal branching, pattern recognition, and dynamic systems, through mechanisms that had no direct human analog, and a person who was half Velhari and half human had, if they were fortunate and attentive and had grown up in the right environments, access to a kind of dual processing. Orin could think when he chose to, in both modes simultaneously. He had spent his career using this ability carefully, because it made people uncomfortable, and because the Joint Command had a complicated relationship with anything that felt like Velhari-adjacent cognition in their officers. His report on the patience engine after the 9th battle was 5 pages long. 4 pages were a technical analysis of the engine's observed behavior, the patterns and how the Velhari fleet moved, the timing signatures, the telltale smoothness of coordinated action that came not from practice, but from simultaneous access to a shared computational output. The 5th page was a single paragraph, which his commanding officer at the time had marked speculative, and which had sat in an intelligence archive for 2 years without anyone acting on it. The paragraph read, "The engine optimizes for highest probability outcomes. This is its design and its strength. It is also, by mathematical necessity, a systematic underweighting of low-probability events. The engine does not ignore low-probability outcomes. It calculates them, but weights its responses toward the most likely enemy actions. A commander who consistently chose actions that the engine assessed as low probability would face a system that was, by design, less prepared to respond to them. The practical challenge is that low-probability tactical choices are, in almost all cases, low probability because they are tactically inferior. The question is whether there exists a class of decisions that are simultaneously low probability and not ultimately self-defeating. Irrational in the tactical sense, but rational in a deeper strategic sense. I believe this class exists. I have not yet determined how to construct it. The 10th and 11th battles came and went. After the 11th, the outer systems were effectively lost. The Velhari held a corridor through human space that would allow them to threaten the inner colonies within 18 months, and the Joint Command was having the kind of meetings where people's voices got very quiet and very careful. Orin, by this point, was a commander. He had spent 2 years thinking about the 5th page of his intelligence report. He had, he believed, determined how to construct it. He requested a meeting with the fleet admiral. He titled his presentation, in the agenda that got circulated to senior staff, proposed tactical framework for engagement with Velhari forces. His aide, who had read the framework, pulled him aside before the meeting and said, very quietly, "Sir, they're going to think you've lost your mind." Orin straightened his uniform. "That," he said, "is rather the point. The briefing room on the constant meridian held 32 people when full. For Orin's presentation, it held 26, which meant the 6 most skeptical members of Fleet Command had already found reasons not to attend, a fact that Orin noted and found, on balance, slightly encouraging. The skeptics who showed up were, at minimum, curious. Fleet Admiral Daravos sat at the head of the table. She was 61, thin in the way of people who eat because they remember to rather than because they want to, with the kind of attention in her eyes that made junior officers feel simultaneously seen and transparent. She had commanded the 3rd battle at Coldwater Star, the one that still appeared in the lost column despite 3 subsequent rewrites of the official record. She had no illusions about what the patience engine was. Orin stood at the display board and did not begin with his conclusions. He began, instead, with a game. "I want each of you," he said, "to tell me the most efficient route from this position." He highlighted a marker on the tactical display. "To this one." He highlighted a second point, 3 sectors away, with a specific obstacle field between them. They told him. The answers came quickly from experienced tactical minds. There were minor variations, but the general shape of the solution was the same. Go around the obstacle field, approach from the open corridor to the northeast, standard flanking geometry. That, Orin said, is what the engine would model. Every one of those solutions is what it expects. He paused. Now, what is the worst route? Silence. Directly through the obstacle field, said Captain Renmack, who was sitting at the far end of the table and who had the particular expression of a person who suspects they're being set up for something. You'd lose ships to navigation collisions. You'd arrive in disarray. You'd have no tactical formation left worth speaking of. Correct, Orin said. It's a terrible approach. The engine gives a probability of approximately 3%. Ships attempting it. In its models, given current Valhari sensor capability and the known composition of my proposed fleet, 3%. He let the number sit for a moment. Do you know what the engine does with a 3% probability event? Calculates a response, Voss said. Calculates a response and deprioritizes it. The response still exists. But the computational weight behind it, the depth of the modeling, the attention paid to how that branch develops, is a fraction of what applies to the 97%. The engine is not omniscient. It runs deep models on what it considers likely and shallow models on what it considers unlikely. It is making a rational resource allocation, and the allocation is correct because 3% events almost never happen. Orin set down his pointer. Unless you specifically design a battle plan to be that event. The room was quiet. It was a different quality of quiet than before. Not skeptical silence, but the silence of people working through an implication. You're proposing, said Admiral Tomas Cravander, who was the ranking naval officer present and who would look a man who would survive 11 defeats by deciding, early in the process, that he would survive them, that we deliberately take the worst tactical approach in every engagement. Not the worst, Orin said, the approach that the engine models as worst probable. Those are different things. The engine models probability based on the assumption of rational actors. I am proposing that we become systematically and deliberately irrational actors, not randomly irrational. That would be chaos, and we would lose. Strategically irrational. Every decision in my plan has a reason behind it, but the reason is not visible to a system that models rational tactical choice. He pulled up the battle plan. It was, by any conventional reading, a document that should have come with medical consultation attached. The proposed engagement was at the Harrow system, a region of space the Valhari held with a fleet of 42 vessels, against which Orin was proposing to send 60 human ships. So far, so standard. Then the specifics began. He was proposing to split the fleet into 4 unequal groups, not the standard 3, not any tactically motivated division, but 4 groups in a size ratio of roughly 30, 15, 9, and 6. He was proposing that the largest group approach on the most direct vector possible, the most obvious approach, the one the engine would model first and weight highest, and then, rather than engaging, decelerate sharply at the outer engagement range and hold position. The second group would simultaneously approach from an angle that was neither optimally flanking nor optimally direct, a vector that accomplished nothing in particular from any conventional tactical standpoint. The third group, the 9 ships, would enter the debris field on the obstacle route approach that Orin had just described as tactically disastrous. The fourth group, the 6 ships, would hold in reserve at the very edge of center range and do absolutely nothing. Then, the instructions of the main group, at a precise moment timed to the engine projected response cycle, not attack, but perform a rapid series of evasive maneuvers. Not evasive maneuvers in response to incoming fire. Evasive maneuvers in empty space against nothing while holding position. The fleet equivalent of a person in an empty room suddenly throwing themselves sideways to avoid an imaginary obstacle. Admiral Cravander was the first to speak. Commander, are you aware that your main group, doing those evasive maneuvers, would cross each other's firing arc 6 separate times? They would be more danger to each other than to the Valhari. Yes, and the 9-ship group in the debris field, their projected navigation collision rate, going in without clearance runs, is approximately 17% chance of at least 1 navigation loss. Yes, I know. You're planning for friendly fire risk and navigation accidents. I'm planning for the appearance of friendly fire risk and navigation accidents. The maneuvers have been plotted. They are tighter than anything Command normally certifies, but they are executable. The debris field route has been surveyed. There's a path through it. It is simply a path that no rational navigator would take, and the engine knows this. Orin moved to the next page of the plan. I need ships that can make those maneuvers. I need navigators who can memorize a path through the Harrow debris field and execute it under combat conditions. And I need something harder than any of that. What? Voss asked. I need Command to authorize a battle plan that looks, from every external vantage point, like the decisions of a fleet commander who has broken under the pressure of 11 consecutive losses. He said it without apology, without softening. If it looks rational, the engine will model it as rational. If the engine models it as rational, we are back to calculating against a system that calculates better than we do. The irrationality cannot be a surface feature. It has to be deep. It has to be real enough that when the engine runs its models on our opening moves, it generates a probability distribution that says, this fleet is not executing a coherent strategy. And then, while it is parsing the chaos, we are already 3 moves into a plan it never fully weighted. The room processed this. Captain Mack said, slowly, and your reserve, the 6 ships at the edge of sensor range. What do? Nothing, Orin said, until the moment they do everything. And the engine will have spent the entire battle discounting them, because ships that sit at the edge of sensor range doing nothing are not a tactical threat. They're a curiosity, a low-probability concern. He paused. Until they're not. He had prepared for a longer fight than he got. He had prepared rebuttals to 12 objections, a supplementary technical analysis of the engine's probability weighting architecture, and a historical precedent survey covering 42 engagements from human military history in which apparent irrationality had created tactical advantage. He used, in the end, perhaps a third of this material. What he had not prepared for was Admiral Voss looking at the plan for a long time in silence, and then looking at him with an expression he could not entirely parse, and saying, the 5-page report, after the 9th battle, that was yours. Yes, Admiral. I read it 3 times, she said. I put it down each time, because I couldn't see how to get from the observation to a plan. She looked at the battle plan on the display. How long have you been working on this? Since the morning after I wrote the report, he said. 2 years. She nodded slowly. Cravander was making an expression of a man watching something he does not entirely approve of and knows he will not stop. Several other officers were looking at the plan with the focused intensity of people who have been presented with something that is either brilliant or catastrophic and cannot yet determine which. There are conditions, Voss said finally. I would expect nothing else. You command the engagement personally, from a ship in the main group. You do not direct from a rear position. I had planned for that. The navigators for the debris field run are volunteers. No one gets assigned to that group, and if the volunteer count doesn't reach 9 ships crewed, the plan doesn't run. Agreed. And if at any point in the engagement your judgment is that the plan is failing, not just struggling but failing, you have authorization to call withdrawal. You do not stay in a losing battle because you've committed to the framework. Orin nodded. Understood. Then, said Admiral Voss, and the word carried the weight of 11 defeats and something new that might have been hope or might have been desperation, and was perhaps both, get your volunteers. He had his 9 ships within 48 hours. The volunteers for the debris field run had, in several cases, stood in line. The Harrow system's primary star was an old K-type, dim and reddish, and it painted everything in the system in shades of copper and amber. The debris field that ringed the system's dead foreplanet was mostly silicate rock and ancient ice, unremarkable as debris fields went, except that it was dense enough to scatter sensor signals and create the irregular navigation hazard that made the interior route suicide and the exterior route slow. Orin had spent 2 months learning the debris field geometry the way a musician learns a score, not understanding it intellectually but internalizing it, so that the path to the rocks existed in his body as much as his mind. The Velhari fleet was arrayed, as expected, in the crescent formation the engine preferred for system defense. 42 ships, the psi vessels in their characteristic gray, positioned at the precise coordinates the engine's models would have recommended. They were, in every visible way, ready. Orin looked at them on the tactical display for a moment. Then he gave the order that opened the engagement. The main group of 30 ships began their approach on the direct vector, the most obvious, most expected line of attack. Orin could almost feel the engine's attention swing toward them. Here is the primary threat. Here is the thing that must be countered. Here is the attack we have modeled and prepared for. The Velhari crescent began its adjustment. The subtle repositioning that presses the formation shift the engine had prescribed. Textbook, perfect, exactly as he had told the admirals it would begin. Then the second group of 15 ships made their approach, not from a flanking angle, but from a vector that accomplished nothing in particular. Too far right for an effective flank, too close to the debris field to have clean firing lines. An approach that no tactician would prescribe because it had no evident purpose, which meant the engine would be generating probability models to determine what the purpose might be, running branches and sub-branches, allocating computational weight, to figuring out what human intention was being served by this inexplicable movement. And then, before the engine could reach its conclusions, the main group did something no fleet does. They decelerated to holding speed and began evasive maneuvers, not in response to fire, not in response to any incoming threat. They simply, from the outside, went a little bit mad. 30 heavy ships, capable of devastating firepower, maneuvering in tight, complex, apparently reactive patterns against nothing, crossing each other's arcs, doubling back, describing movements that would mean something as a response to an attack that was not happening. On the Velhari command vessels, the Patience engine encountered a distribution problem. It had modeled the direct approach at 67% probability. It had modeled several flanking variations at various lower probabilities. It had assigned this opening sequence. Main force halts and performs evasive maneuvers in empty space, a probability of roughly 4%, which meant it had a model for the response. But the model was shallow, was a sketch rather than a full calculation, was the engine's equivalent of a note that said if this happens, probably do this rather than the deep certainty it had running for everything else. The Velhari fleet hesitated. This was new. In 11 engagements, the Velhari had never hesitated. It was only a moment, perhaps 8 seconds, but 8 seconds in a battle where every Velhari maneuver had previously been instantaneous was a geological age. The crescent formation, which had begun its adjustment for the expected direct engagement, paused mid-movement, and then began a different adjustment, and then paused again. The engine was recalculating. It was updating its probability distribution, reallocating computational weight, building deeper models for the scenario it had underweight. Orin watched this on the tactical display and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something he cautiously identified as optimism. Group 3, he said, begin your run. The 9 ships of Group 3 crossed the edge of the debris field and entered the interior route. Inside the debris field, the light from Harrow's red sun came filtered through ice and rock into something close to amber twilight, and the navigation warnings were constant. Proximity alerts, collision risk flags, automated systems screaming data that the crews had been trained to read not as warnings but as information. The path that Orin had surveyed was there. It was real. It was also approximately the width of a reasonable mistake. Commander Orin, who was leading Group 3 from the light cruiser Deliberate Risk, she had named it herself in a previous command. The name had seemed less pointed before this particular assignment, held her course, and did not allow herself to look at the proximity warnings more than once every 30 seconds. Her navigator, Ensign Cord, had the survey route memorized to a degree that was either impressive or alarming, and was calling adjustments in a voice that had been calm for the first 40 seconds of the run, and was still technically calm now in a way that a person bracing for impact is technically calm. They were inside the debris field. The Velhari sensors were scattered. The engine had no reliable telemetry on their position, which meant it could not model their trajectory, which meant it was tracking them as a probability distribution rather than a certainty. A probability distribution of 9 ships moving through an area where the engine believed no rational navigator would go. Meanwhile, Group 2 had continued its purposeless approach and was now close enough to the Velhari formation that the engine had to weight it as a real threat, which meant it was running models for what this inexplicable flanking, not flanking movement was actually designed to do, and the answer kept coming back as uncertain, which was itself a kind of poison in a system designed around certainty. The engine did not have an uncertain mode. It had probabilities ranging from very high to very low, and when the probabilities were low and dispersed, it responded by doing its best, but its best was less than its worst when certainty was available. Orin gave the next order. Main group, execute Pattern 7. Pattern 7 was the part of the plan that had made his aide look at him with the most concern. The 30 ships of the main group, which had been doing their inexplicable evasive maneuvers, suddenly broke into 5 subgroups and began approaching the Velhari crescent from 5 different angles simultaneously. Not a coordinated envelopment, which would have been sensible, but 5 separate attacks on a rhythm that was staggered by intervals that had no tactical logic. The first subgroup engaged 30 seconds before the second, which engaged 90 seconds before the third, which engaged 2 minutes before the fourth, and the fifth held for another 4 minutes entirely. No conventional tactical theory supported this timing. The intervals were chosen specifically because they matched no standard human attack pattern, which meant the engine's pattern recognition functions, which were very good at identifying human tactical templates, would keep finding near matches, and then discovering the timing was slightly wrong, and the effort of that continuous near identification was computational friction. The Velhari fleet, to its credit, responded. The crescent fractured into the responsive formation the engine prescribed, and it was a good response, a correct response to what it was modeling as a disorganized multi-vector attack from an irrational enemy fleet. It would have worked against an actually disorganized fleet, against Orin's fleet, which was disorganized in a very organized way. It was approximately 1 step behind. The first subgroup's engagement was sharp and brief, not attempting to hold a line, but driving directly through the Velhari formation, taking hits that a rational fleet would not absorb, and emerging out the other side. Damage taken. Ships that should not have been pushed through a combat corridor pushed through it anyway, because the plan required them on the other side. The engine modeled the trajectory of the first subgroup and predicted its next move. Its prediction was incorrect. The second subgroup came in 90 seconds later from an angle that was correct only in the context of where the first subgroup had gone, which was information the engine had, but which its models had not fully processed into the next decision cycle, because the timing was wrong, because no fleet did things on this rhythm, because the engine kept trying to find a template this matched and finding templates that almost fit but didn't quite. The third subgroup hit during the moment of Velhari formation adjustment, and all of this was happening while Group 3 was still inside the debris field, tracked by the engine as a probability cloud. 9 ships that might be anywhere in a large volume of rock and ice, modeling what they might do next with the tools available when you do not know where something is. Approximately 19 minutes into the engagement, the patient's engine made a discovery. The process by which it arrived at this discovery was not, from the outside, visible as a single moment. The engine did not have moments. It had continuous calculation, updated in cycles shorter than human perception. But the cycle in which the discovery cohered was, in retrospect, the turning point, the point at which the engine's response to the engagement changed in character rather than just in content. What it noticed was the timing. The staggered intervals of the attack groups had been chosen by Orin to avoid standard templates, but they were not random. Random would have been survivable by the engine. Random intervals produced a distribution, and distributions were calculable. Orin's intervals were irrational but internally consistent. They followed a logic, just not a conventional tactical logic. And the engine, after 19 minutes of fighting a battle that kept producing near matches to known patterns without quite fitting, identified the logic. It was not tactical logic. It was adversarial logic, the logic of a system designed to defeat pattern recognition by being recognizable only to a system sophisticated enough to see what it was actually doing. The engine identified this and updated its models, and for approximately 40 seconds, the Velhari fleet paused again. Not the 8-second hesitation of the opening. A longer pause, a deeper recalculation, and the human fleet, which had been pressing its slight advantage to the continued execution of irrational moves, felt the pause as a change in the quality of the resistance they were meeting. Orin felt it too. His Velhari intuition, The part of his cognition that ran on the same fundamental architecture the engine used registered the shift as something close to a physical sensation, a kind of reorientation, as though the space of the battle had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. "It knows," he said quietly to his tactical officer. "Sir, the engine has identified the framework, not the specific plan, but the approach. It knows we're running on an irrationality doctrine." He looked at the display. "It's recalculating." The Velhari fleet, guided by updated engine output, began doing something it had not done in engagement so far. It changed the scale of its response. Rather than countering individual moves, it began positioning for the space of moves, setting up formations that would be effective not just against the current state of the human fleet, but against a range of possible future states. The engine was hedging. It was spreading its responses across more of the probability distribution, accepting lower performance against the most likely events in exchange for better coverage of the less likely ones. This was, Orin recognized, the correct adaptation. The engine had correctly identified the strategy. It was correctly adjusting. If the battle continued from this moment as a straightforward contest between his fleet and an adapted Velhari fleet, the Patience engine would still win. Because the fundamentals had not changed, it was still faster, more precise, more capable of integration than any human fleet coordination could achieve. He had planned for this moment. "Contact Group 4, he said. "Execute." Group 4 had been sitting at the edge of sensor range for 23 minutes doing absolutely nothing. 6 ships. In the engine's probability model, they were the least significant element of the human fleet. A reserve, probably, held back for withdrawal cover, the kind of force you keep in the rear because you know you might need to run. The engine had them modeled as a low-probability concern, something between 3 and 6% of its current attention allocation, a background calculation rather than an active model. When Group 4 moved, it moved in a way that rewrote the architecture of the entire engagement. The 6 ships did not approach on a combat vector. They approached on a rescue vector, a trajectory that made sense only if they were heading for a specific location in the debris field, toward a ship in distress, the kind of movement that happened in training exercises and humanitarian operations, but not in battles. Because in battles, a distress ship was simply a lost ship, and no rational commander sent 6 vessels to retrieve it when the battle was still live. The engine modeled this trajectory and produced, for the first time in the engagement, a genuine error. It concluded that the approaching ships were executing a retreat assistance maneuver, a probability it gave 61% confidence. They were not. The rescue vector, precisely plotted, brought all 6 ships to a position directly adjacent to the exit point of the debris field interior route, the point where 9 ships would merge if they had successfully navigated the path that no rational navigator would take. Group 3 came out of the debris field 9 seconds later. They did not come out in formation. They came out distributed across a 300-kilometer spread, separated by the navigation demands of the route, shields at varying states of depletion. 2 of the 9 ships trailing debris from near-miss encounters with field rocks. They looked, on any tactical display, like survivors rather than combatants. They were both. Group 4 met them at the exit point, and the 6 and 9 combined into something that was not a standard tactical unit, but was also not a mess. 15 ships, emerging from the blind spot of the debris field into the interior edge of the Velhari Crescent, the position that the engine had spent the entire battle holding as secure because no rational approach could threaten it. The engine updated its models. The position it had held as secure was no longer secure. The formation that had been appropriate 2 minutes ago was now wrong. The depth of the model it had been running for Group 3, which had been a shallow model, a probability distribution, a what if they do something we cannot track, now needed to become a full combat model, immediately, in the middle of an engagement where 8 other things were also requiring full modeling. For the first time in 11 engagements, the Patience engine was oversubscribed. It did not make mistakes, precisely. The calculations it ran were still correct. But there's a difference between correct and sufficient, and the engine, which had never had to manage a battle, in which the human fleet was simultaneously threatening from 6 directions, 3 of which had been assessed as low probability, was producing outputs that were correct for each individual threat assessment and insufficient for the integrated response. The Velhari fleet was executing good responses to each element of the situation. The elements were not waiting for the responses to complete. The human fleet, meanwhile, was executing its plan, and the plan was ugly and damage-intensive, and nobody who watched it from the outside could have identified a design within it. But there was a design, and the design was working not because it was beating the engine at calculation, but because it was feeding the engine more correct calculations, and the engine had computational priority available to weight properly, and the gaps between the calculations were where the battle was being decided. The Velhari formation began to contract. This was the correct response to distributed threat. Pull in, consolidate, create defensible space. The engine prescribed it, and the fleet executed it. Orin watched it happen and counted silently. "There it is," he said. "Sir, the contraction point." He traced it on the display. "They're pulling to that coordinates cluster. The engine has identified it as the most defensible position given current threat distribution." He paused. "It's correct. It is the most defensible position." His tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Orin, looked at the display and then at him. "Then we have a problem." "We would," Orin agreed, "if I were planning to attack that position." He stood up straighter. "Contact all groups. Execute final sequence." The final sequence was the thing Orin had spent the most time on, and it was also the thing that was hardest to explain to the admirals who reviewed the plan, because it did not look like a military maneuver. It looked like something a poet might have invented if a poet knew fleet tactics and had been deprived of sleep for several days. The human fleet did not attack the Velhari contraction point. All 5 groups, the main force, now reorganized from its pattern attack, the purposeless second group, the debris field survivors, and their Group 4 companions, pulled back simultaneously, not retreating, not withdrawing in the tactical euphemism sense that the Joint Command had learned to use, simply stepping back, creating distance, declining the engagement that the Velhari had just organized themselves to win. The engine modeled this immediately and produced a high-confidence conclusion. The human fleet is withdrawing. Probability 73%. Recommend pursuit formation to maximize damage and prevent effective retreat. The Velhari fleet began to open up from its contracted position, extending into pursuit geometry the engine prescribed. And then the human fleet stopped withdrawing. What happened next was a thing that Orin had not been able to write in the plan itself, had not been able to prescribe as a sequence of maneuvers, because it was not, in the end, a sequence of maneuvers. It was a decision, made simultaneously by 60 human crews who had been briefed not on what to do, but on what they were trying to do, and who made the choice themselves in the moment based on that understanding. They turned around, not at the optimal moment, not from the optimal position, not in a formation that any tactical doctrine would have recognized as the recommended attack geometry. They turned around because the Velhari fleet was mid-transition between the contracted defensive formation and the pursuit formation, which is to say it was between states, which is to say it was, for the first time in 11 engagements, not yet in configuration the engine had prescribed, and the human fleet drove into that between state with everything they had. The engine was not wrong about any of it. It had modeled the human withdrawal correctly, 73% probability, and the withdrawal had been real. Orin had genuinely pulled back, because the plan required the Velhari fleet to begin the transition, and the transition would not begin unless withdrawal looked like a withdrawal because it was won. He had not tricked the engine. The engine had correctly assessed his fleet's movement as a withdrawal, because his fleet was withdrawing. It had correctly prescribed pursuit, because pursuit was the right response. It had correctly begun the formation transition, because the transition was correct. It had simply not modeled at sufficient weight the possibility that a human fleet doing something correct and sensible and rational, withdrawing from a position they could not win, would stop and look at the half-formed Velhari pursuit formation and choose to die in it rather than run away from it. Not because dying in it was strategically optimal, because trying was. This was the thing the engine could not fully model. Not irrationality in the sense of randomness, not irrationality in the sense of error, but irrationality in the sense of willingness, the human capacity to choose a costly action not because the expected value justified it, but because some other calculus, one that did not reduce the probability and outcome, said it was the right thing to attempt. The engine understood human behavior as a function of rational self-interest plus tactical training plus situational constraint. It had no variable for, because it seemed worth doing even if it probably wouldn't work. It had a variable for it, technically. It called it noise. It assigned it low weight. The battle lasted another 11 minutes. The Velhari fleet caught mid-transition, fought extremely well. The engine continued to calculate and prescribe, and the fleet continued to execute with a precision that had 111 consecutive engagements. Individual Velhari ships performed maneuvers that, in a different battle, would have been decisive. The Crescent, even fractured in mid-transition, was deadly. But deadly and position are different things, and the human fleet was inside the position before it fully formed, and inside the position the arithmetic was different, and the engine's optimization was finding local maxima in a space that had shifted out from under it. The Velhari fleet withdrew at the 17-minute mark of the final sequence. Not a rout, not a collapse, a calculated withdrawal, prescribed by the engine based on updated probability assessments, executed with the same precision the fleet brought to everything. The engine was not wrong to prescribe it. The engagement was, from any reasonable probability standpoint, lost, and the correct response to a lost engagement was to preserve what could be preserved. The engine had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had simply been designed to defeat a different kind of opponent. Orin watched the Velhari ships fold into their withdrawal formation and felt, not triumph, exactly, something more complicated and more tired. He had 31 ships left from 60, which meant 29 ships gone, which meant people, which meant the specific grief that lives in victory when the victory is real, and the cost is also real, and no amount of rightness in the plan changes the weight of those two things sitting together. Fleet, he said over the general channel, cease active engagement, begin recovery operations. He paused. Good work. All of it. He sat down. Essavain brought him a report on casualties. He read it and set it down and read it again. Then he pulled up a blank document on his console and began to type. The after-action process took 3 weeks. There were briefings and debriefs and the kind of meetings that generate other meetings. And people who had not attended Orin's original presentation attended meetings about that presentation. And there was a period of approximately 4 days when certain members of Joint Command who had not been in the briefing room developed opinions about whether the victory had been won through genuine strategic innovation or through a reckless disregard for conventional doctrine that happened to succeed, which Orin found approximately as exhausting as the battle itself, and about as tractable. Admiral Voss appeared in these discussions infrequently and selectively, but when she appeared she was effective, and after the 4 days of discussion shifted from whether this was legitimate to what it implied, which was a more interesting conversation, and one Orin could participate in without wanting to walk into the vacuum. The technical analysis team spent 2 weeks reviewing the engine's decision logs, data recovered from the Velhari ships captured in the engagement, and produced a report confirming what Orin had predicted. The engine had performed correctly by its own optimization criteria at every point. It had correctly identified the direct approach as the highest probability attack. It had correctly modeled the second group as a low-confidence flanking feint. It had correctly assigned low probability to the debris field run. It had correctly identified the irrationality framework at the 19-minute mark and begun adapting. It had correctly modeled the final withdrawal as a 73% probability event. It had been right about everything. The report said this in technical language over 47 pages, and what it came down to was, the engine was right about everything except the weight assigned to the possibility of a fleet choosing, at the critical moment, not the action with the highest expected value, but the action that seemed most worth attempting regardless of expected value. The engine had a model for this. The model said low probability. The fleet had not cared about the probability. The technical team flagged this in their conclusion as a potential vulnerability in the engine's architecture. They recommended countermeasures. They noted that the Velhari would certainly update the engine's models based on this engagement, recalibrating the probability weights it assigned to human irrational behavior, increasing the computational depth of its low probability branches. Orin read this part of the report carefully and thought about it for a long time. The team was correct. The engine would adapt. The specific plan, executed again, would not work the same way. The irrationality doctrine could not be a doctrine in the conventional sense, a fixed approach applied repeatedly, because any approach applied repeatedly became, for a system with the engine's capabilities, a pattern, and patterns were what the engine was best at countering. What it could be, he thought, was a principle, a way of approaching the question. Not do these specific or rational things, but continue to find the space where rational optimization fails to model what you are actually willing to do. The engine would adapt its model of human irrationality. Yes. But human irrationality was not a fixed quantity. It was renewable. Every new engagement had new versions of the question, what is worth trying even if it probably won't work? And the answers were not predictable because they came from something the engine, for all its capability, was not running. The specific individual human experience of being in a situation that matters and choosing action anyway. This was not, he thought, a strategic advantage that could be institutionalized. You could not order it. You could not train it into cruise in the way you train navigation or fire coordination. What you could do was understand it clearly enough to build plans around it. Plans that required nothing of crews except their own judgment at the critical moment. Plans that set up the space where judgment could matter and then trusted the people inside that space to do what people do when it comes to it. He had been working on his after-action report for the entire 3 weeks, in parallel with the briefings and the meetings. It was not a long document for a battle of this significance. The expected submission was 20 to 30 pages of tactical analysis, appendices covering each phase of the engagement, detailed coverage of the decision logic at each stage. Orin's report was 9 pages of precise tactical analysis, and then a final section that he titled, because he had been thinking about the title for 2 years, Notes on Being Unreasonable. The final section read, in full, "The patience engine is not wrong about us. It models human tactical behavior correctly. It assigns probabilities correctly. It identifies patterns correctly and adapts to new information correctly. When it was defeated at Harrow, it was not because it made an error in any step of its calculation. It was because its calculation described a real world perfectly up to a certain boundary, and at that boundary, the boundary where a decision is no longer primarily about probability, but about what seems worth doing. The calculus fails not because the math is wrong, but because the thing being calculated is not math. Human beings, under sufficient pressure and with sufficient clarity about what they're fighting for, will sometimes do things that are not rational in any framework that begins with the assumption that survival and success are the organizing values. This is not a flaw in human cognition. It is, I would argue, the specific thing about human cognition that is most difficult to model from the outside, because it requires not just knowing what a person values, but knowing what they will choose to honor when the honoring is expensive. The patience engine will update. It will raise the probability it assigns to irrational human action. It will build deeper models for low-probability branches. It will become hard of surprise. This is the nature of adaptive systems, and the engine is the best adaptive system we have encountered. What I would suggest, in terms of implications for future doctrine, the answer is not to find new irrational moves. The answer is to understand why the irrationality was effective, and the answer is not tactical. It was effective because the crews of 31 surviving ships and 29 lost ships chose, at the moment the battle could have been retreat and been survived and been a reasonable outcome, to turn around instead, not because the math said to, because they thought it was worth trying. The engine can be updated to assign a higher probability to this. It cannot be updated to feel it, and feeling it, not as an emotion but as a commitment to something that exceeds probability, is what produces a decision. You cannot model the decision without modeling the commitment. You cannot model the commitment without having it. This is not an argument for recklessness. The plan at Harrow was precise. The moves were calculated. The timing was exact. The irrationality was structured irrationality. And without the structure, it would have been simply expensive chaos. But the structure was only the vessel. The thing that made it work was what the crews poured into the vessel when the moment came. I cannot prescribe that. I can only note it, and note that it is a genuine asymmetry, not in our favor in most respects. But in this one, a system optimized for correct outcomes will always underweight the possibility of an opponent who has decided, in a way that bypasses optimization, that some outcomes are worth pursuing even when the probability does not recommend them. The engine is right. We are sometimes unreasonable. That is, occasionally, the one thing it cannot account for. File for the record. Commander Orin Haswilhari, following the engagement at Harrow System, Day 211 of the current year. Battle Plan Title. Notes on Being Unreasonable. Status, Victory. He submitted the report on a Tuesday morning. ate lunch without tasting it, and spent the afternoon in the memorial service for the 29 ships. There were words spoken at these things, always, because words were the best available technology for bridging the distance between an event and its meaning, and he listened to all of them. Commander SAE Politive Group 3 was there, still carrying the particular held-together quality of a person who had come to the debris field and come out the other side and was still processing the ratio of those two facts. He found her afterward in the corridor outside the chapel space. "Your navigation team," he said, "pass along my personal commendation." "I will," she said. "Then, sir," at the exit point, when we came out and the formation was gone and Group 4 was there, I thought we'd gotten it wrong. I thought the route had taken too long. "You were 43 seconds late," he said, "but it still worked." The engine was compensating for the debris field scatter. The model window was wider than I told you it would be. He paused. "I didn't know if the window would be wider. I said it would be tighter because I needed you to push the pace." She looked at him. "So you told us it would be harder than it was." "I told you what would make you move fast enough." He held her gaze. "If that was wrong of me, I'm open to the argument." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the corridor viewport, the Harrow system's red star was below the horizon, and the light was a specific gray-blue of a space that had recently had a battle in it and was now provisionally quiet. "It wasn't wrong," she said. "I just want to know how much of this you knew." "Most of it," Orin said, "and enough of what I didn't know that the most wasn't enough. That's what Group 4 was for. Not as a tactical unit. As a margin." He paused. "You always need a margin." She nodded slowly, and then there was nothing else to say that the moment required, and they went their separate ways in the corridor, which was as it should be. Orin returned to his office and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then he opened his console, navigated to file report, and looked at the title one more time. Notes on being unreasonable. He had been thinking, since the battle, about the patient's engine and its size ships recalibrating. It was out there, he knew, processing the engagement data from Harrow, building new models, raising new probability estimates, growing toward a version of itself that would be harder to defeat this way. It would not stay defeated. Nothing that could calculate stayed defeated for long. But he had been thinking about something else too, something his mother had told him, in the years when she was living among the Velhari, and he was young enough that language was still new and interesting rather than simply functional. She had told him that the Velhari word for uncertainty was the same as their word for potential. Not two senses of the same word, but one concept. The space of things that had not yet been determined was also, in their understanding, the space of things that could still become anything. The patient's engine reduced uncertainty toward zero in every engagement. That was its design. That was its strength. It occurred to him, sitting in the quiet of his office with the gray-blue light of an aftermath outside the viewport, that this was also, in a certain sense, its limitation. A system that existed to eliminate uncertainty was a system that found it difficult to operate in the presence of uncertainty without reducing it, that read the uncertain thing as an input to be processed, a problem to be solved, a probability to be assigned. A person who had grown up between two worlds might learn, if they were lucky, that some uncertainties were not to be eliminated but inhabited, held, moved inside of. This was uncomfortable and produced no probability distributions. It produced, sometimes, the specific feeling of turning around when you could have kept running, because something in the configuration of the moment said, "This is the one to try." He was already thinking about the next plan. He opened a new document. He left the title field blank, for now.